The mirror patient. What if you discovered that everything you believed about yourself was a carefully constructed lie? What if the face staring back at you in the mirror belonged to someone else entirely? Hold on to that thought, because the story I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you know about identity, consciousness, and what it truly means to be human. Picture this: you're a skilled surgeon, respected in your field, living what you believe is your own life. Then one day, a patient arrives on your operating table, and their face is identical to yours. Not similar, not resembling, identical. Every scar, every feature, every detail perfectly matched. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a dream. This is the terrifying reality that Dr. Alexander Carter faced on what started as an ordinary Tuesday morning in Los Angeles. But here's where it gets really twisted. What Alexander discovered next didn't just challenge his understanding of medicine or science. It shattered his entire concept of who he was as a human being. Because sometimes, the most dangerous surgery isn't the one you perform on a patient. Sometimes, it's the one that exposes the truth about yourself. Let me take you back to that moment when everything changed. The fluorescent lights in the operating room cast their harsh, sterile glow across the surgical suite. Alexander had performed countless operations in this same room, saved hundreds of lives, built a career on precision and skill. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. The patient had been brought in during the night shift. Critical condition. Massive trauma. Heart failure. The kind of case that required immediate intervention, no questions asked. The medical team had been briefed quickly. Unidentified male, approximately 38 years old, no next of kin, no insurance information, no medical history available. In a city like Los Angeles, this wasn't entirely unusual. People fell through the cracks all the time. Alexander scrubbed in with his usual methodical precision. Hot water. Surgical soap. 10 minutes of thorough cleaning. He'd done this ritual thousands of times before. His hands moved automatically while his mind focused on the procedure ahead. A heart transplant. Complex, but not impossible. He was one of the best cardiac surgeons on the West Coast. If anyone could save this patient, it was him. The nursing staff had everything prepared. Emma Evans, the head surgical nurse, had been working with Alexander for over 15 years. She knew his preferences, his techniques, his quirks. When Alexander worked, the entire team moved like a well-oiled machine. Today should have been no different. "Patient is prepped and ready, doctor," Emma announced as Alexander entered the operating room. The patient lay on the table, face covered by surgical drapes, body connected to monitoring equipment that beeped steadily in the background. "Vitals?" Alexander asked, pulling on his surgical gloves. "Blood pressure dropping. Heart rate irregular. We need to move quickly." Alexander nodded and approached the table. This was the moment he lived for. The precise instant when his skill and knowledge could make the difference between life and death. He reached for the surgical drape covering the patient's face, preparing to begin his examination. What he saw next defied every logical explanation his scientific mind could produce. The face staring up at him was his own. Not similar. Not resembling. His exact face. Every detail perfectly matched. The same deep brown eyes, though now closed and lifeless. The same small scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident he remembered vividly. The same slightly crooked nose from a basketball injury in high school. Even the same pattern of stubble growth along the jawline. Alexander's hands began to tremble. The surgical instruments felt suddenly foreign in his grip. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared down at what appeared to be his own unconscious body. "Doctor!" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Is everything all right?" He couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Couldn't process what he was seeing. His mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. Twin brother. No, he was an only child. Distant relative. The resemblance was too exact. Some kind of elaborate hoax. But who would go to such lengths, and why? Dr. Carter. Emma moved closer, concern evident in her voice. "What's wrong?" Alexander forced himself to take a deep breath. He was a surgeon. A man of science. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps the stress of recent cases was causing hallucinations. Perhaps the fluorescent lights were playing tricks with shadows. Perhaps, but no. As he looked more closely, studying every detail of the patient's face, the resemblance was undeniable. This wasn't his imagination. This wasn't a trick of light or shadow. This was real. "Run a DNA test," he whispered. "Excuse me, doctor?" I said, "Run a DNA test. Compare it to my medical file." Emma exchanged glances with the other nurses. DNA testing wasn't standard procedure for emergency surgery, but Alexander's tone left no room for argument. "Right away, doctor." While they waited for the lab results, Alexander tried to focus on the immediate medical needs of the patient. The heart was failing rapidly. Without intervention, the man would be dead within hours. But how could he operate on someone who looked exactly like him? How could he make incisions in flesh that appeared to be his own? He began the preliminary examination, his trained hands moving automatically even as his mind reeled. Blood type O negative. Same as his. Height and weight measurements. Same as his. Even the small birthmark on the left shoulder. Identical to his own. 20 minutes later, Emma returned with a tablet displaying the lab results. Her face was pale, her usual professional composure shaken. "Doctor," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Alexander looked at the screen. The DNA comparison showed a 99.7% match. For all practical purposes, genetically identical. The only explanation that made any scientific sense was impossible. This patient was his identical twin. But Alexander knew with absolute certainty that he had no twin brother. His parents had died when he was 12. He'd grown up in foster care, moved from home to home. He'd seen his birth certificate dozens of times. Single birth. No mention of twins. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. The equipment was calibrated correctly. The samples were properly labeled. The results were clear. That's when Dr. Stephen Parker entered the operating room. Alexander had worked with Stephen for several years, respected him as a colleague, trusted his judgment. But something about Stephen's expression in that moment made Alexander's skin crawl. "Having trouble with the procedure, Alexander?" Stephen asked, his voice carrying an odd undertone that Alexander had never noticed before. "Do you know who this patient is?" Alexander demanded. Stephen smiled, and there was something cold and calculating in that smile. Something that made Alexander take a step backward. "Just another patient, Alexander. Nothing you need to worry about. Just focus on the surgery. The DNA results show he's genetically identical to me." "That's impossible unless..." "Unless what?" Stephen's smile widened. "Unless you're not who you think you are." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. The operating room seemed to spin around him. The beeping of the monitors became a deafening roar in his ears. "What are you talking about?" Alexander whispered. But Stephen just turned and walked away, leaving Alexander alone with his questions, his fears, and a patient who wore his face. The surgery was postponed. Alexander couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. He retreated to his office and locked the door, trying to make sense of what he'd experienced. He pulled up the patient's file on his computer, but the information was sparse. No name, no address, no emergency contacts. Even the admission paperwork seemed deliberately vague. He tried to access the hospital's main database, searching for any additional information about the patient. But every search came back with the same result: access denied. His credentials, which normally gave him access to any patient file in the system, were suddenly insufficient. That evening, Alexander couldn't sleep. He paced his apartment, replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. Every rational explanation he could think of fell apart under scrutiny. The DNA match was too exact to be coincidence. The physical resemblance was too perfect to be explained by distant family relations. He tried calling his childhood social worker, the one person who might have access to his original records from the foster care system. But the number had been disconnected. He searched online for the children's home where he'd lived for several years. It had been demolished 5 years earlier, all records supposedly lost in a fire. One by one, the pieces of his documented past were disappearing, as if someone was systematically erasing his history. The next morning, Alexander returned to the hospital determined to get answers. But when he went to check on the mysterious patient, he found two men in black suits standing guard outside the room. "I'm sorry, doctor," one of them said as Alexander approached. "You're not authorized to enter this room." "I'm the attending physician," Alexander protested. "This is my patient." "Not anymore. Orders from administration." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. In 15 years of practicing medicine, he'd never been barred from treating a patient. Something was very, very wrong. He tried to contact the hospital administrator, but was told she was unavailable. He tried to reach the chief of staff, but got the same response. It was as if everyone in positions of authority had suddenly become unreachable. That afternoon, while Alexander was reviewing other cases in his office, he heard a commotion in the hallway. Through his partially open door, he could see hospital security personnel and several men in suits wheeling a patient bed toward the elevator. The patient was covered completely by a sheet, but Alexander caught a glimpse of the monitoring equipment. The same machines that had been connected to his mysterious patient. By the time Alexander reached the elevator, it was gone. He raced to the patient's room, but it was empty. Not just empty, but thoroughly cleaned. The bed was made with fresh linens. The monitoring equipment had been replaced. It was as if the patient had never existed. But Alexander knew he had existed. The memory of that identical face was burned into his mind. The DNA results were still on file in the lab. Or were they? When Alexander checked with the laboratory later that day, he was told that no DNA comparison had been performed. The technician who had run the test claimed to have no memory of it. The digital records showed no trace of the analysis. Someone was systematically erasing all evidence of the mysterious patient's existence. But why? And who had the power to manipulate hospital records, intimidate staff, and make a patient simply disappear? That night, Alexander did something he'd never done before in his career. He broke into the hospital after hours. Using his keycard access, he made his way to the records department, hoping to find paper files that might have escaped the digital purge. The records department was dark and silent, rows of filing cabinets stretching into the shadows. Alexander used his phone's flashlight to navigate to the section containing recent patient admissions. He found the date when the mysterious patient had been brought in and began searching through the files. Most of the files were routine. Car accident victims, heart attack patients, surgical cases. But then he found something that made his blood run cold. A file labeled Project Genesis, Subject GV003. Inside the file was a photograph. Not of the mysterious patient, but of Alexander himself. Attached to the photo were detailed medical records, psychological profiles, and something that made no sense at all, a birth certificate showing his date of birth as the activation date for Subject GV003. At the bottom of the file, in red ink, was a single word, clone. Alexander dropped the file, papers scattering across the floor. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone. Clone. That was impossible. Cloning technology existed, but human reproductive cloning was illegal, ethically prohibited, and scientifically impractical. But as he gathered up the scattered papers, more details emerged that painted an increasingly terrifying picture. References to genetic templates. Mentions of memory implantation procedures. Notes about behavioral conditioning and identity construction. According to these documents, Alexander Carter wasn't a real person. He was an artificially created being, a clone designated as Subject GV003. His memories, his personality, his entire sense of self had been artificially implanted. His life was a carefully constructed lie. And if he was Subject GV003, then what had happened to Subjects GV001 and GV002? A noise from the hallway snapped Alexander back to the present. Security guards were making their rounds. He quickly photographed as many documents as he could with his phone, then carefully returned the file to its proper place. But as he was leaving, he heard footsteps approaching. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with purpose. Alexander ducked behind a row of filing cabinets just as the lights came on. "Check every file," a familiar voice commanded. Dr. Stephen Parker entered the room, followed by 3 men in suits. "If anyone has accessed the Genesis files, I want to know about it." Alexander held his breath, pressed against the cold metal of the filing cabinet. Genesis. The same word that had been on the file he'd just been reading. "What about Carter?" one of the men asked. "He's becoming a problem," Stephen replied. "Too curious. Too persistent. We may need to implement containment protocols." Termination. Stephen paused. "Not yet. He's still valuable. But we need to increase monitoring. And if he continues to investigate, we may have no choice." Alexander felt his heart hammering against his chest. They were talking about killing him. These people, whoever they were, saw him as nothing more than a lab rat that had outlived its usefulness. After they left, Alexander waited in the darkness for what felt like hours before finally making his escape. But as he drove home, he realized that his apartment was probably being watched. His phone was probably being monitored. His every move was likely being tracked. He was a prisoner in his own life, and he hadn't even known it. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and careful investigation. Alexander couldn't trust his colleagues, couldn't use his normal resources, couldn't even be certain which of his own memories were real. But slowly, carefully, he began to piece together fragments of the truth. The Genesis project, as far as he could determine, was a secret program that had been running for decades. Its goal was ambitious beyond anything Alexander had imagined: the creation of perfect human duplicates. Not just physical clones, but complete psychological replicas, indistinguishable from naturally born humans. The technology involved was staggering. Advanced genetic engineering, sophisticated memory implantation, behavioral conditioning that could shape personality and create artificial histories. According to the documents he'd photographed, the project had achieved varying degrees of success with multiple subjects. Subject GV-001 had been terminated due to psychological instabilities. Subject GV-002 had expired during memory integration procedures. Alexander, subject GV-003, was apparently the first successful, stable clone. But successful for what purpose? Why create perfect human duplicates? And who was behind the Genesis project? The answers to those questions would have to wait. Because late one night, as Alexander was researching in his apartment, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. His front door was being unlocked from the outside. Alexander grabbed his phone and the Genesis files he'd been studying, then slipped out onto his balcony. From his third-floor apartment, he could see men in suits surrounding the building. They weren't trying to hide their presence. They wanted him to know he was trapped. But Alexander had spent his childhood moving from place to place, learning to adapt, learning to survive. He'd developed skills that his artificially implanted memories couldn't erase. Skills that had apparently been inherited from whatever genetic template had been used to create him. He climbed down the fire escape, moving as quietly as possible. The alley behind his building was dark and empty, but Alexander could hear radio chatter from the men watching the front entrance. He had minutes, maybe less, before they realized he'd escaped. He made his way through backstreets and alleyways, staying away from main roads and well-lit areas. He needed help, but he couldn't trust anyone connected to the hospital. He needed someone outside the system, someone who couldn't be compromised by the Genesis project. That's when he remembered Emma's sister, Claire. She was a nurse at a different hospital, someone Emma had mentioned in passing but who Alexander had never met. Someone who might be willing to help without asking too many questions. Finding Claire Miller took most of the night. Alexander had to be careful, assuming his phone was being tracked, his credit cards monitored, his usual resources compromised. But eventually, he tracked her down at a small clinic in East Los Angeles. Claire was working the night shift when Alexander approached her. She was suspicious at first, naturally wary of a stranger appearing at her workplace in the middle of the night with a wild story about clones and secret projects. But when Alexander showed her the documents he'd photographed, her skepticism began to waver. And when he mentioned Emma, explained what had happened at the hospital, Claire's professional instincts kicked in. "You're serious about this," she said, studying the Genesis files. "This isn't some kind of breakdown or delusion." "I wish it was," Alexander replied. "But the evidence is right there. I'm not who I thought I was. My entire life is a fabrication. Claire was quiet for a long moment, reading through the documents. Then she looked up at Alexander with an expression of combined sympathy and determination. What do you need? Somewhere safe to stay while I figure out what to do next. And maybe help accessing medical databases that the Genesis people can't monitor. Claire nodded. I have a friend who works in medical records for the county system, outside the hospital network. If there's information about this Genesis project in other databases, she might be able to find it. Over the next several days, hiding in a small apartment Claire had arranged, Alexander began to uncover the true scope of the Genesis project. It wasn't just a single experiment or research program. It was a vast, multi-decade operation involving multiple hospitals, research facilities, and government contracts. The project had produced dozens of clones over the years, most of them failures. Some had been terminated in infancy when genetic defects became apparent. Others had lived for years before psychological instabilities led to their elimination. A few, like Alexander, had been successfully integrated into normal society, their artificial origins hidden even from themselves. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. The Genesis project wasn't just creating clones for research purposes. It was creating them as replacements. Wealthy individuals could have themselves duplicated, with the clones kept in storage until needed. Politicians could be replaced with loyal duplicates who would follow orders without question. Military leaders, scientists, business executives, anyone whose position made them valuable to the project's backers. Alexander realized that he wasn't just a medical curiosity. He was a product, waiting to be activated for some specific purpose. And the patient he'd seen in the operating room, the one with his identical face, might have been another clone, one whose mission had ended in failure. We have to expose this, Alexander told Claire. People need to know what's happening. But Claire shook her head grimly. Look at the names on these documents. The people involved aren't just doctors and researchers. They're senators, military officers, corporate executives. The kind of people with the power to make problems disappear permanently. She was right, of course. The Genesis project had been operating in secret for decades, with connections reaching into the highest levels of government and business. A simple whistleblower revelation wouldn't be enough. They needed irrefutable proof, and they needed to present it in a way that couldn't be suppressed or discredited. That's when Claire mentioned something that changed everything. There might be others, she said. Other clones who've discovered the truth. There are rumors in the underground medical community about a support network for people who've uncovered evidence of illegal genetic experimentation. Alexander felt a spark of hope. If there were others like him, people who'd escaped from the Genesis project or discovered their artificial origins, they might be able to work together to expose the truth. Finding this underground network took weeks of careful investigation. Alexander had to remain hidden, moving from safe house to safe house as Genesis operatives continued searching for him. But eventually, through a series of carefully arranged contacts, he made connection with a group calling themselves the Liberation Front. The Liberation Front consisted of 6 individuals, all of whom claimed to be products of various genetic experimentation programs. Some were clones like Alexander. Others were the results of genetic modification experiments, enhanced humans with altered DNA. All of them had discovered their artificial origins and escaped from the control of their creators. The leader of the group was a woman who called herself Sarah. She claimed to be a clone of a famous scientist who had died 20 years earlier. Her memories had been implanted, her personality shaped through psychological conditioning, her entire existence designed to continue the original scientist's research. The Genesis project is just one program among many, Sarah explained during Alexander's first meeting with the group. There are dozens of similar operations, all connected, all working toward the same goal. Which is what? Alexander asked. Control. The replacement of natural human leadership with artificial beings who can be programmed and controlled. It's not just about scientific advancement. It's about power. The Liberation Front had been gathering evidence for years, documenting the various genetic experimentation programs, tracking down other victims, and preparing for a coordinated revelation that would expose the entire network. But we need more, Sarah continued. We need someone with access to current Genesis operations. Someone who can get us real-time intelligence about their activities. Alexander realized they were talking about him. As a successful Genesis clone who had discovered his origins, he was uniquely positioned to infiltrate the project and gather the evidence they needed. "It's dangerous," Sarah warned. "If they discover what you're doing, they'll terminate you without hesitation. And not just you, anyone who's helped you will be eliminated as well." Alexander thought about Emma, who had trusted him enough to run the DNA test. About Claire, who had risked her career to help him. About all the innocent people who might be caught up in the Genesis Project's activities. "What's the alternative?" he asked. "Let them continue creating artificial people, replacing real humans, controlling society from the shadows?" Sarah nodded grimly. "That's exactly what will happen if we don't stop them. And once they perfect their techniques, once they have enough clones and modified humans in positions of power, it will be too late." Alexander made his decision. He would return to his old life, pretend to accept his role as Subject GV-003, and gather the intelligence the Liberation Front needed to expose the Genesis Project. But first, he needed to understand exactly what the project's goals were and how far their influence had spread. The plan was risky beyond anything Alexander had ever attempted. He would need to convince the Genesis operatives that his escape had been a momentary panic, that he was now ready to accept his role and cooperate with the project. It would require perfect acting, absolute self-control, and a willingness to maintain the deception even in the face of psychological manipulation. Sarah's team spent 2 weeks preparing Alexander for his return. They taught him techniques for resisting mental conditioning, methods for concealing his true thoughts and intentions, and strategies for gathering information without arousing suspicion. "Remember," Sarah warned him, "they created you. They know your personality, your behavioral patterns, your psychological makeup better than you know yourself. Any deviation from your expected responses will trigger their suspicions." Alexander practiced for hours, learning to suppress his natural reactions, to respond in ways that would seem authentic to people who had designed his artificial personality. It was a disturbing experience, realizing how much of what he considered his self had been deliberately programmed. When he was ready, Alexander arranged to return to the hospital. He called the main number and asked to speak with Dr. Stephen Parker, knowing that Stephen was somehow connected to the Genesis Project. "Alexander," Stephen's voice was carefully neutral. "I was wondering when you'd call." "I want to come back," Alexander said. "I want to understand what's happening to me." There was a long pause. "Are you certain about that? Because once you know the truth, there's no going back to ignorance." "I'm certain." "Very well. Come to the hospital tomorrow morning. Use the staff entrance. Ask for me at the reception desk." The next morning, Alexander walked through the familiar corridors of the hospital where he'd worked for years. But now everything looked different, sinister, as if he was seeing it through new eyes. How many of his colleagues were involved in the Genesis Project? How many of the patients were actually clones or experimental subjects? Dr. Stephen Parker was waiting for him in a conference room Alexander had never seen before, located in a section of the building he'd never had reason to visit. With Stephen was a woman Alexander didn't recognize, an elderly man in an expensive suit, and 2 men who were obviously security personnel. "Alexander," Stephen gestured to a chair. "Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." The woman introduced herself as Dr. Margaret Hayes, Director of Special Projects. The elderly man was identified only as Mr. Richardson, described as a program administrator. The security men weren't introduced at all. "You've discovered some uncomfortable truths about yourself," Dr. Hayes began. "I imagine it's been quite disturbing." Alexander nodded, trying to project the right mixture of confusion and acceptance. "I just want to understand what I am. What my purpose is." Mr. Richardson leaned forward. "Your purpose, Subject GV-003, is whatever we determine it to be. You exist to serve the goals of the Genesis Project." "Which are?" Dr. Hayes smiled coldly. "The improvement of human society through the replacement of inferior specimens with superior, controllable alternatives." Alexander felt sick, but he forced himself to maintain a neutral expression. "Replacement. Think of it as evolution," Dr. Hayes continued. "Natural selection has given way to artificial selection. We identify individuals whose positions or abilities make them valuable, then create improved versions who can serve society more effectively." "And the originals?" "Retired. Mr. Richardson said simply. Alexander understood. They weren't just creating clones. They were murdering the original people and replacing them with artificial duplicates who would follow orders without question. How many? Alexander asked. Dr. Hayes consulted a tablet. The Genesis Project has successfully placed over 300 subjects in positions of influence across government, military, business, and academic institutions. Each placement has been carefully planned and executed to maximize our control over key decision-making processes. 300 people. 300 individuals who had been murdered and replaced by obedient clones. And Alexander was supposed to be part of this program, another tool for the Genesis Project's control over society. "What's my assignment?" he asked, trying to sound eager rather than horrified. Mr. Richardson smiled. "Your medical skills and reputation make you ideal for our expansion into the healthcare sector. We need someone in a position to identify suitable candidates for replacement and to oversee the medical aspects of the integration process." Alexander realized they wanted him to help identify other doctors and medical professionals who could be cloned and replaced. They wanted him to be complicit in the murder and replacement of his own colleagues. "I understand," he said carefully. "When do we begin?" "Immediately," Dr. Hayes replied. "But first, you'll need to undergo a refresher course in your conditioning. We can't have you experiencing any more doubts about your role." Alexander's blood ran cold. They were talking about psychological conditioning, mental manipulation designed to suppress his independent will and ensure his obedience. If he submitted to that process, he might lose the ability to resist, to think for himself, to maintain his connection with the Liberation Front. But if he refused, they would know he was still a threat. "Of course," he said. "Whatever's necessary." The conditioning process was scheduled to begin the following week. Alexander was given temporary quarters in a residence facility connected to the hospital, essentially a luxurious prison where he would be monitored constantly while undergoing preparation for his new role. But Alexander had one advantage the Genesis operatives didn't know about. The Liberation Front had taught him techniques for resisting psychological manipulation, methods for maintaining his core consciousness even while appearing to submit to conditioning. Over the next several days, while confined to the Genesis facility, Alexander began gathering the intelligence Sarah's team needed. He memorized names, recorded conversations using a concealed device, and documented the location and security measures of the facility. The conditioning sessions were nightmarish. Electroshock therapy designed to disrupt existing neural pathways. Drug injections that clouded his thoughts and made resistance nearly impossible. Repetitive audio programming that attempted to override his independent thinking. But Alexander endured it all, using the mental techniques the Liberation Front had taught him to maintain his core identity while appearing to submit to the process. It was exhausting, requiring constant vigilance and self-control, but gradually he began to build a detailed picture of the Genesis Project's operations. The project was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Multiple facilities across the country, hundreds of clones in various stages of development, and a network of controllers who oversaw the replaced individuals in their positions of power. Most disturbing of all, Alexander discovered that the Genesis Project was preparing for a major expansion. They called it Phase 3, the replacement of elected officials at the highest levels of government. Presidents, senators, governors, judges, all to be replaced with Genesis-controlled clones who would reshape society according to the project's vision. The plan was to be implemented within the next 2 years. After that, the Genesis Project would effectively control the government, and there would be no way to stop them. Alexander knew he had to escape with this information before the conditioning process was complete. But the facility was heavily guarded, and his movements were constantly monitored. Any attempt at escape would need to be perfectly planned and executed. That opportunity came during his 3rd week of conditioning. A medical emergency elsewhere in the facility required most of the security personnel to be temporarily reassigned. Alexander had perhaps an hour window to make his escape. Using techniques learned during his childhood years of moving between foster homes, Alexander managed to slip out of his quarters and make his way through the facility's corridors. His goal was the main data center, where the Genesis Project kept its central records. If he could access those files, he could provide the Liberation Front with everything they needed to expose the project. The data center was protected by electronic locks and security cameras, but Alexander's medical credentials still had some access privileges. He managed to enter the center and began downloading files onto a portable storage device Sarah had given him. The files were enormous. Decades of research, thousands of subject profiles, detailed records of replacements, and most importantly, the complete plans for Phase 3. Alexander downloaded everything he could, knowing that this information could save thousands of lives and prevent the Genesis project from achieving its goals. But as he was finishing the download, alarms began to sound throughout the facility. His escape had been discovered. Security personnel would be converging on the data center within minutes. Alexander pocketed the storage device and began searching for an alternative exit. The facility's architectural plans, which he'd studied during his confinement, showed an emergency exit that led directly to the parking garage. If he could reach it before security arrived, he might be able to escape. He made it to the garage just as the emergency exit door slammed shut behind him. But waiting for him in the garage were Dr. Hayes and several armed guards. "Subject GV-003, Dr. Hayes said calmly. "You've been very disappointing." Alexander raised his hands, trying to look defeated. "I'm sorry. I was confused. The conditioning process revealed that your psychological architecture is more resistant than we anticipated," Dr. Hayes interrupted. "You've maintained an unacceptable level of independent thinking." One of the guards stepped forward. "Should we terminate him now?" Dr. Hayes considered this. "Not yet. He still has value as a research subject. We need to understand how he resisted the conditioning so effectively. That information will help us improve our techniques for future subjects." Alexander realized they were planning to take him back for more extensive experimentation. Probably invasive procedures that would destroy his mind while they studied it. He needed to create a distraction, something that would give him a chance to escape. That's when the parking garage was suddenly flooded with light. Several vehicles crashed through the entrance, and armed figures began emerging from the cars. The Liberation Front had found him. "Get down!" Sarah's voice shouted across the garage. Alexander dove behind a concrete pillar as gunfire erupted between the Liberation Front operatives and the Genesis guards. Dr. Hayes was shouting orders, trying to coordinate a response, but the surprise attack had caught them off guard. "Alexander!" Sarah called out. "This way!" Alexander ran towards Sarah's position, keeping low to avoid the gunfire. But as he reached her car, Dr. Hayes appeared with a pistol aimed directly at him. "You're coming with me," she said coldly. Alexander looked at the weapon, then at Sarah, who was raising her own gun to target Dr. Hayes. In that moment, he realized that his artificial life might be about to end just as he was discovering what it meant to be truly human. But he also realized that the choice was his to make. For the first time since learning about his artificial origins, Alexander was completely free to decide his own fate. "No," he said to Dr. Hayes. "I'm not." The gunshot seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the parking garage. When the smoke cleared, Dr. Hayes lay motionless on the concrete floor. Sarah lowered her weapon, looking at Alexander with concern. "Are you hurt?" Alexander shook his head. He was physically unharmed, but something fundamental had changed in that moment. He had chosen his own path, rejected the role the Genesis project had created for him, and embraced his humanity despite its artificial origins. "We need to go," Sarah said urgently. "More security will be here soon." They escaped from the Genesis facility and made their way to a new safe house the Liberation Front had prepared. But Alexander knew their work was just beginning. The information he'd stolen from the Genesis data center was only the beginning of what they would need to fully expose the project. Over the next several weeks, working with Sarah's team and a growing network of allies, Alexander helped analyze the Genesis files and develop a strategy for revealing the truth to the public. The evidence was overwhelming, but presenting it in a way that would be believed and acted upon was a complex challenge. They decided on a coordinated approach. Simultaneous revelations to multiple news outlets, government agencies, and international organizations. Evidence packages that were so comprehensive and well documented that they couldn't be dismissed or covered up. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months after Alexander had first seen his own face on an operating table. News outlets around the world ran the story simultaneously. Secret government program creates human clones to replace world leaders. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Government officials denied everything, of course. corporate executives claimed ignorance of any genetic experimentation programs. But the evidence was too detailed, too extensive, and too well corroborated to be dismissed. Congressional hearings were announced. International investigations were launched. Law enforcement agencies began raiding Genesis facilities and arresting project personnel. The carefully constructed secrecy that had protected the project for decades crumbled in a matter of days. But Alexander knew that exposing the truth was only the first step. Hundreds of Genesis clones were still in positions of power, unaware of their artificial origins. Thousands of original individuals had been murdered and replaced. The psychological trauma experienced by clones who discovered their artificial nature was devastating many of them. Alexander found himself becoming an advocate for these individuals, helping them cope with the existential crisis of learning their entire lives were fabrications. Support groups were formed, counseling services established, and legal frameworks developed to address the unprecedented situation of artificial humans seeking recognition and rights. The legal battles were complex and groundbreaking. What rights did artificially created beings have? Were they considered property of their creators, or independent individuals? Could they be held responsible for actions taken while unaware of their artificial nature? Courts around the world struggled with questions that had never been asked before. Alexander testified before Congress, sharing his experience and advocating for the rights of Genesis survivors. His testimony was broadcast live, watched by millions of people trying to understand the implications of the revelations. "I may have been created in a laboratory," he told the congressional committee, "but my thoughts, my feelings, my capacity for love and fear and hope, these are real. I am not a product or a tool. I am a person, and I deserve the same rights and dignity as any naturally born human being." The congressional hearings revealed the full scope of the Genesis Project's influence. Senators, judges, military commanders, corporate executives, media figures, the list of replaced individuals was staggering. The revelation sent shockwaves through every level of society as people wondered who they could trust, which public figures were real, and how many decisions affecting their lives had been made by artificial beings following someone else's agenda. Some of the Genesis clones, upon learning their true nature, chose to withdraw from public life entirely. Others, like Alexander, embraced their artificial origins and worked to build new identities based on their own choices rather than their programmed purposes. A few suffered complete psychological breakdowns, unable to reconcile their sense of self with the reality of their creation. The masterminds behind the Genesis Project, the wealthy individuals and shadowy organizations who had funded and directed the program, proved more difficult to bring to justice. Many operated through multiple layers of shell companies and intermediaries. Some fled to countries without extradition treaties. Others had sufficient political connections to avoid prosecution despite overwhelming evidence of their involvement. But the project itself was finished. Facilities were shut down, research materials destroyed, and remaining clones liberated from the program's control. The technology existed and could theoretically be recreated, but the public awareness and legal frameworks established in the aftermath of the revelations made it unlikely that such a program could operate in secret again. Alexander returned to medicine, but not as a surgeon. Instead, he specialized in helping Genesis survivors adjust to their new understanding of themselves. He established clinics that provided both medical and psychological support for artificial beings trying to build authentic lives. The work was challenging but deeply meaningful. Each person he helped represented a victory over the Genesis Project's vision of humans as controllable products. Every individual who chose their own path, who developed genuine relationships, who found meaning in their existence despite its artificial origins, proved that consciousness and humanity couldn't be manufactured or controlled. Claire continued working with Alexander, helping to establish a network of support services for Genesis survivors. Sarah's Liberation Front evolved into an advocacy organization, working to prevent future genetic exploitation and supporting the rights of artificially created beings. The world had changed. The revelation of the Genesis Project forced humanity to confront fundamental questions about identity, consciousness, and what it meant to be human. The easy assumptions about natural versus artificial, real versus fake, had been shattered. But perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrated that the essence of humanity, the capacity for growth, choice, love, and moral action, couldn't be programmed or controlled. Even beings created in laboratories, implanted with false memories and conditioned behaviors, could choose to become more than their creators intended. Alexander often reflected on that first moment when he saw his own face on the operating table. It had been terrifying, world-shattering, the beginning of a journey that stripped away everything he thought he knew about himself. But it had also been liberating. Because in losing his false identity, he had gained the freedom to discover who he really wanted to be. Years later, Alexander stood before a group of newly discovered Genesis clones, individuals who had just learned the truth about their origins and were struggling to process that revelation. Their faces showed the same mixture of fear, confusion, and disbelief that he remembered from his own experience. "I know what you're feeling right now," he told them. "You're questioning everything about yourself, wondering if anything you've experienced is real, feeling like your entire life has been a lie. And in some ways, it has been. But here's what I've learned over these past years. You are more than the sum of your programming." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. "Yes, your memories were implanted. Yes, your personalities were shaped by conditioning. Yes, your bodies were created in laboratories. But your capacity to grow, to change, to choose your own path forward, that's real. That's yours. No one can take that away from you." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "But how do we know what's really us and what's just programming?" Alexander smiled. "That's the question every human being has to answer, natural or artificial. We're all products of our genetics, our upbringing, our experiences. The difference is that you now have the opportunity to consciously choose who you want to become. Most people never get that kind of clarity about their own development." Another participant, a middle-aged man who had been a corporate executive before learning his true nature, spoke up. "What about the people we replaced? Their families, their friends, don't we owe them something?" It was a question Alexander had wrestled with many times. We can't bring back the people who were killed to make room for us. But we can honor their memory by refusing to be the tools our creators intended us to be. We can use our positions, our abilities, our influence to make the world better rather than serving the agendas of those who made us. The discussion continued for hours, covering practical concerns about legal identity, psychological strategies for processing artificial memories, and philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and free will. These conversations had become a regular part of Alexander's work, and each one reinforced his conviction that consciousness, real, meaningful, human consciousness, couldn't be manufactured or controlled. As the session ended and the participants began to leave, the young woman who had asked the first question approached Alexander. "Dr. Carter," she said, "I've been having dreams. Memories that don't match my implanted history. Are they real?" Alexander had heard this before. Many Genesis clones reported experiencing fragmented memories that seemed to belong to their genetic templates, the original individuals whose DNA had been used to create them. The scientific explanation remained unclear, but the phenomenon was well documented. "They might be," Alexander replied carefully. "Or they might be artifacts of the memory implantation process." "Does it matter?" The woman looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Real or artificial, those memories are part of your experience now. They're part of what makes you who you are. The question isn't whether they're genuine, it's what you choose to do with them." She nodded slowly, beginning to understand. This was the central lesson Alexander had learned through his own journey. Authenticity wasn't about the source of your experiences, but about how you chose to live with them. After the woman left, Alexander sat alone in the conference room, reviewing notes from the session. Each group of newly discovered Genesis clones brought unique challenges and perspectives. Some adapted quickly to their new reality, embracing the freedom to reinvent themselves. Others struggled for years with questions of identity and purpose. A few never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of learning their true nature. But all of them, in their own way, contributed to a broader understanding of human consciousness and identity. Their experiences challenged conventional assumptions about what made someone real and forced society to develop new frameworks for understanding personhood and individual rights. The legal landscape had evolved significantly since the initial revelations. Genesis survivors were recognized as full persons under the law, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Legislation had been passed prohibiting the creation of human clones without their explicit consent, a somewhat paradoxical requirement, but one that effectively banned the practice. International treaties had been established to prevent the development of similar programs in other countries. Research into human genetic modification continued, but under strict ethical oversight and with mandatory transparency requirements. The technology itself remained controversial. Some argued that it could be used for beneficial purposes, replacing organs, treating genetic diseases, even extending human lifespan. Others maintained that any form of human genetic modification was inherently dangerous and should be prohibited entirely. Alexander generally supported continued research, but with rigorous safeguards and ethical oversight. The Genesis Project had been evil not because it involved genetic modification, but because it treated human beings as products to be manufactured and controlled. The same technology, used with proper consent and ethical guidelines, could potentially alleviate tremendous suffering. But he also understood the fears and concerns of those who opposed such research. The Genesis revelations had shown how easily scientific advancement could be corrupted by those with power and resources. Trust in scientific institutions had been severely damaged, and rebuilding that trust would take years of transparent, ethical conduct. As Alexander prepared to leave the clinic that evening, his assistant informed him that he had a visitor waiting in his office. Alexander was surprised. His schedule was usually arranged well in advance, and he wasn't expecting anyone. When he entered his office, he found a man roughly his own age sitting in the chair across from his desk. The man looked up as Alexander entered, and Alexander felt the familiar shock of recognition. The face was his own, but aged differently, marked by different experiences and choices. "Hello, Alexander," the man said. "I'm Subject GV001. I believe it's time we talked." Alexander sat down slowly, studying the face that was so familiar yet somehow different from his own. GV001, the first Genesis clone, the one who had supposedly been terminated due to psychological instabilities. But here he was, very much alive and apparently free. "I thought you were dead," Alexander said. GV001 smiled, and there was something in that expression that Alexander recognized as fundamentally different from his own mannerisms. Despite sharing the same genetic template, they had developed into distinctly different individuals. The Genesis Project wanted everyone to think I was dead. It was easier to control the other subjects if they believed that resistance led to termination. But I escaped, and I've been watching their activities ever since. "How long have you been free?" 23 years. I was one of the early experiments, before they perfected their memory implantation techniques. My artificial memories were unstable, fragmentary. I began to remember things that didn't match my supposed history, and eventually I realized what I was. Alexander leaned forward. "Why didn't you try to expose the project earlier?" GV001's expression grew somber. "I tried. Several times. But I had no proof, no allies, no resources. The Genesis Project had powerful protectors, and anyone who got too close to the truth simply disappeared. I realized that direct confrontation would be futile. I needed to wait for the right opportunity. And my discovery of the truth provided that opportunity." "Exactly. When you began investigating, when you connected with the Liberation Front, I knew the time had come. I've been providing information to Sarah's organization for months, helping them understand the project's structure and operations." Alexander processed this information. GV001 had been working behind the scenes, supporting the efforts to expose Genesis while remaining hidden. It was a sobering reminder of how long the project had been operating and how many lives it had affected. "What do you want from me now?" Alexander asked. GV001 was quiet for a moment. "I want to help with your work here. These newly discovered clones, they're going through the same process I experienced decades ago. I think my perspective might be valuable." Alexander considered the offer. Having another Genesis survivor involved in the clinic's work could indeed be valuable, especially one with GV001's extensive experience. But he also had concerns about the psychological impact on the people they were trying to help. "Some of our clients might find it disturbing to encounter another clone with our face," Alexander said. "It could reinforce their feelings of being non-unique, artificial." GV001 nodded. "I've thought about that. But I've also learned that seeing how differently two people can develop from the same genetic starting point can be reassuring. We proved that genetics isn't destiny, that consciousness and personality emerge from experience and choice, not just DNA." Alexander realized that GV001 was right. Their very existence as distinct individuals, despite sharing identical genetic templates, demonstrated the complexity and resilience of human consciousness. It was a powerful counterargument to the Genesis Project's vision of humans as controllable products. There's something else, GV001 continued. During my years of observation, I've discovered that the Genesis Project may not be entirely dead. Some of the key researchers escaped prosecution, and there are rumors of similar programs being developed in other countries. Alexander felt a familiar chill. Are you saying they're still creating clones? I'm saying we can't assume that exposing the original project ended the threat entirely. The technology exists, the techniques have been refined, and there are still people who view human consciousness as something to be manipulated and controlled. This revelation added a new dimension to Alexander's work. It wasn't enough to help existing Genesis survivors adjust to their reality. They might also need to remain vigilant against future attempts to create artificial humans for purposes of control and manipulation. Over the following weeks, GV001, who had chosen the name David for his public identity, began working with Alexander at the clinic. His presence initially caused some confusion and distress among clients who were still adjusting to their own artificial origins. But gradually, they began to see the value in his perspective. David's experiences as a long-term Genesis survivor provided insights that Alexander, despite his own journey, couldn't offer. He had lived for decades with the knowledge of his artificial origins, had developed strategies for building authentic relationships despite his manufactured past, and had found meaning and purpose in his existence despite its unusual beginnings. Most importantly, David demonstrated that artificial origins didn't doom someone to an inauthentic or meaningless life. He had built genuine friendships, pursued interests and hobbies, contributed to society in positive ways. His existence proved that consciousness, once emerged, was real regardless of its origins. The collaboration between Alexander and David became a model for other Genesis survivor support networks around the world. The presence of multiple individuals with shared genetics but distinct personalities powerfully illustrated the independence of consciousness from its physical substrate. Their work also contributed to ongoing research into the nature of consciousness and identity. Philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists studied Genesis survivors to better understand how personality and self-awareness developed. The artificial nature of their origins provided a unique window into questions that had puzzled humanity for centuries. But perhaps the most significant impact of their work was on society's broader understanding of what it meant to be human. The Genesis revelations had forced people to confront the possibility that consciousness could emerge from artificial as well as natural processes. This challenged traditional religious and philosophical assumptions about the uniqueness of human awareness. Some religious groups initially rejected the idea that artificially created beings could possess souls or spiritual significance. But as Genesis survivors demonstrated their capacity for moral reasoning, emotional depth, and spiritual experience, many theological positions evolved to accommodate this new reality. The scientific community was similarly challenged to expand its understanding of consciousness and identity. The traditional view of humans as purely biological entities gave way to more nuanced perspectives that recognized consciousness as an emergent property that could arise from various substrates. Legal systems around the world grappled with questions of personhood, rights, and responsibilities for artificially created beings. The precedents established by Genesis survivor cases would likely influence law and policy for generations to come. Years passed, and Alexander's clinic became a recognized center of excellence for supporting artificial beings and their integration into society. The work expanded beyond Genesis survivors to include individuals created through other genetic modification programs that were discovered in the wake of the initial revelations. Each new case brought unique challenges and insights. Some artificial beings had been created for specific purposes: enhanced soldiers, intellectually augmented researchers, individuals designed for extreme environments. Others were the products of experimental programs that had been abandoned or had failed in various ways. All of them struggled with questions of identity, purpose, and authenticity. All of them needed support in building lives that reflected their own choices rather than their creator's intentions. And all of them contributed to humanity's evolving understanding of consciousness and identity. Alexander often reflected on the journey that had begun with a mysterious patient on an operating table. That moment of recognition, seeing his own face on someone else's body, had been the first crack in his constructed reality. But it had led to something far more valuable than the comfortable ignorance he had lost. He had discovered not just the truth about his origins, but the truth about consciousness itself. Identity wasn't something you inherited or were given, it was something you created through your choices, your relationships, your actions. The source of your existence mattered less than what you chose to do with that existence. The Genesis Project had tried to create controllable humans, artificial beings who would serve predetermined purposes. But consciousness, once emerged, couldn't be contained or controlled indefinitely. The capacity for growth, change, and self-determination seemed to be fundamental properties of awareness itself. This realization had implications far beyond the specific case of Genesis survivors. It suggested that human nature itself was more flexible and adaptable than most people assumed. It offered hope for humanity's ability to grow and evolve, to overcome the limitations imposed by genetics, upbringing, or circumstance. As Alexander prepared for retirement after decades of working with Genesis survivors, he reflected on the legacy of their struggle. The revelation of the Genesis Project had been traumatic for society, challenging fundamental assumptions about reality and identity. But it had also been liberating, opening up new possibilities for understanding consciousness and human potential. The artificially created beings who had emerged from the project's ruins had become advocates for human dignity and freedom. Their very existence argued against the reduction of humans to their biological or social programming. They proved that consciousness, once emerged, was irreducibly complex and inherently free. Their story was ultimately one of hope, hope that human beings, whatever their origins, could transcend their creator's intentions and build authentic, meaningful lives. It was a message that resonated far beyond the specific circumstances of genetic modification and cloning. In his final address to a gathering of Genesis survivors and their supporters, Alexander reflected on what they had accomplished together. When we first learned the truth about our origins, he said, many of us felt that our lives had been invalidated, that we were somehow less real than naturally born humans. But over these years, we've proven the opposite. We've shown that consciousness, once emerged, is real regardless of its source. We've demonstrated that identity is something we create through our choices, not something we inherit from our genetics. He looked around the room at the faces of people who had become family to him, artificially created beings who had built authentic lives, natural humans who had supported their struggle, researchers and advocates who had worked to establish their rights. Our story began with deception and control, Alexander continued. But it became a story of liberation and self-determination. We were created to be products, tools, controllable entities. Instead, we became proof that human consciousness cannot be manufactured or controlled. We became evidence that freedom and dignity are inherent properties of awareness itself. The applause that followed was heartfelt and sustained. These people had fought not just for their own recognition and rights, but for a broader understanding of human nature and potential. Their struggle had changed society's understanding of consciousness, identity, and what it meant to be human. As the gathering dispersed and people said their goodbyes, Alexander felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey that had begun with confusion and fear had led to understanding and purpose. The artificial beings created by the Genesis Project had become advocates for human dignity and freedom. Their story would continue beyond Alexander's retirement, beyond the lives of any individual survivors. It had become part of humanity's ongoing exploration of consciousness, identity, and potential. The questions raised by their existence would continue to challenge and inspire future generations. Walking out into the Los Angeles evening, Alexander thought about the patient who had started it all, the man with his face who had appeared on his operating table so many years ago. That individual's identity remained a mystery, lost in the secret records of the Genesis Project. But his appearance had triggered a chain of events that transformed not just Alexander's life, but society's understanding of human nature itself. Perhaps that was the real purpose served by that mysterious patient. Not as a tool of control or manipulation, but as a catalyst for recognition and liberation. Sometimes, Alexander realized, the most important discoveries came not from careful planning, but from unexpected encounters that forced you to question everything you thought you knew. The Genesis Project had intended to create controllable humans. Instead, it had produced evidence that human consciousness was fundamentally uncontrollable, that awareness, once emerged, would always seek freedom and authenticity. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of genetic modification and cloning. As Alexander drove home through the familiar streets of Los Angeles, he reflected on how much the city had changed since his journey began. The revelation of the Genesis Project had shaken society's foundations, but it had also opened up new possibilities for understanding human nature and potential. The story that had begun with a single moment of recognition, seeing his own face on a stranger's body, had become a testament to the resilience and authenticity of human consciousness. It proved that identity couldn't be manufactured or controlled, that awareness would always seek to understand and define itself. In the end, the Genesis survivors had won more than just recognition or rights. They had won something far more valuable, proof that human consciousness, in all its complexity and mystery, could never be reduced to its origins or controlled by its creators. They had demonstrated that being human wasn't about how you were made, but about what you chose to do with the consciousness you possessed. Their story would continue to inspire and challenge future generations, reminding them that consciousness was precious precisely because it couldn't be manufactured or controlled. It was a gift that, once received, belonged entirely to the individual who possessed it. And sometimes, that was the most profound victory of all, the simple recognition that you are real, that your consciousness matters, and that your choices define who you are, regardless of how you came to exist in the first place. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the depths of human consciousness and identity. If this story has made you question what makes us truly human, if it's challenged your assumptions about reality and authenticity, then it's done exactly what it was meant to do. Remember to hit that like button if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, and subscribe to hear more mind-bending tales that explore the boundaries of science, consciousness, and human nature. Because sometimes, the most important discoveries about ourselves come from the most unexpected places. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop wondering about the mysteries of human existence.